Welcome. I'm Jillian Galley. I'm the project director for DAACS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the start of this fall's DAACS Conversations series. For those of you who are new to DAACS, it is short for the Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. I need to let someone else in. And for those of you who, which is a web-based initiative based at Monticello that fosters inter-site comparative research on slavery across the Atlantic world. So today we have a double header. We have two talks. Each one will be about 20 minutes long, and we will follow with discussion. This is our usual format if you're new to us, where we'll have one or two talks and ask people to hold their questions to the end. So our two talks today are part of a series titled Current Research on Historic Landscapes in Virginia. This was organized and guest moderated by Kyle Edwards, and these are part of a series of conference-length talks that were scheduled to appear at the Society for Historical Archaeology meetings in Philadelphia this past January. But because of COVID, many of these conversations did not happen, and we are presenting them here. We presented some in the spring, and we're presenting the remainder in the next two DAACS conversation sessions. So today we're going to get to hear from Sara Bon-Harper and Kyle Edwards. Sara is going to talk first. Sara is a wonderful friend of DAACS and a wonderful, actually, friend of mine. And we've had a great luck of working together for over 22 years now. Sara took her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and for over 11 years, worked as the archaeological research manager at Monticello. She is currently the executive director at Highland, James Monroe Highland in Albemarle County, Virginia. And Sara's talk is titled Changing the Narrative, Public Archaeology at James Monroe's Highland. And once Sara finishes, I will introduce Kyle. We'll finish Kyle's talk and then take questions. So Sara, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm going to go right ahead and do the scary thing of sharing my screen. So if you bear with me just for a second, I'll pull up my slides. All right, I trust y'all can see that. Okay, good. It's good to be with you. All right, so for those of you not in our area, here we are located in central Virginia at James Monroe's Highland in the Piedmont, and really just around a small ridge in the Southwest Mountains from Monticello itself. All right, the sort of national significance of the property is James Monroe's ownership of it, the fifth U.S. president, and he purchased the property in 1793, sold the core, including the house site, in 1826, and the surrounding fields in 1828. Our narratives about the site include Monroe and his contributions to the U.S. political history, and also the lives and contributions of enslaved people, about 53 of whom we can identify now who lived their lives partly or entirely enslaved at Highland. And they make up a very good portion of the work we do and our interest in interpreting to the public. Let's see. Highland has evolved over the years in its naming. Monroe himself decided on calling it Highland rather late in his tenure there. And shortly after he left, it was called Ashlawn. My predecessor as executive director here in the 1980s returned the name Highland to it, and it was Ashlawn Highland. And then in 2016, with our research discoveries, we reclaimed the name Highland, and so we are now officially James Monroe's Highland. And the focus of the site for its public interpretation has been this small white building that you see here. And for a long time, it was misidentified as a remnant wing of James Monroe's main house, which we know from documentary sources was two basic parts, and the smaller one, which appeared to have survived, was identified here in what is standing we know that now that is not true. I'll walk you through that research, but just to clarify, it's this small building here on the left, the white one, that is the Monroe guest house that he had built in 1818 during his first term as U.S. president. And has been overshadowed on the site by this 1870s house. We call it the Massey House for its owner, the Reverend John E. Massey, kind of a player in Virginia politics. So 1870s, and it has at times clouded the story of the site and how it was told. It does hide the smaller house. You see the north face of it here in its sort of current and cute form, which is really a late 20th century fluffing and brushing of it to make it look like part of a president's home. Whereas for most of its existence, it was a 19th century country place. This was its an addition to it, probably just after Monroe sold it. A little bit iffy on that, but definitely not a main entrance or a really elaborate part of the site. So the research about it goes back to the mid-1970s when William and Mary, the current owner, inherited the property. There immediately swirled around Virginia plenty of public questions about the site and about the house. The work done by Southside Historical for a couple of years in the mid-1970s was one of 3 research initiatives. It included architectural history study by Milton Grigg and his team. It included documentary research by reigning Monroe biographer Harry Ammon. Ammon stated definitively that Monroe did own Highland, did live there at least some of the time, and wrote letters from there. And so that was part of the record that we could prove. Grigg and his team also said that there were no material discrepancies between the written record, that is a couple of sketches and the documents, and what he saw in person in the standing house. I don't endorse that conclusion as much, and you'll see why in just a moment. The archaeological report, as most of us who have read or written archaeological reports will say, we always do say, it suggested further excavation. It was inconclusive in terms of the other wing, right? So if the standing house was the smaller of the 2 wings, there was no evidence really of where that other wing was. A little bit later, I'll talk about the ambiguity of which side it should have been on, which is complicated by the written record. Nonetheless, that didn't prevent anyone from going public and saying it was authenticated as Monroe's home. Here we are in the mid-1970s. Think about bicentennial fervor at the time and the interest in these early generation presidents. Although even so, maybe you can lean in to see the caption on the photograph, that ash lawn, a modest home in the rolling hills of Albemarle County, doesn't fit the mold of a presidential abode. And true enough, it doesn't. So, this complicated history of it, even with the stamp of the 1970s research, the ambiguity remained, even though that was the public statement. And so when I arrived in 2012, the questions about the house were kind of in the background. And the idea was that, this was a remnant wing of Monroe's main house, but there were elements that really were questionable about the house. It is a 2-room lobby entrance building, and we know many in Virginia that we can point to that are similar as dependency buildings. And the materials weren't quite the same as in the insurance documents. So plenty of details that didn't quite add up. I will say I was not the first person at all to question the house. I, though, was the first executive director to believe that many questions can be answered with shovel testing. So that's where we headed. Starting with some shovel testing in 2014, and eventually turning that over to the professionals, that is, Rivanna Archaeological Services completed that phase, and then the initial excavations on the main house site, which they found. It's always a little bit hard to say that you have stone in course while it is in an STP, but on the left, we do in fact see a piece of a foundation wall in a shovel test, and plenty of artifacts coming out in the shovel tests in that area. So we certainly knew we had found the remains of an architectural building of some sort, and our next phase was to determine whether they were pushed into that area or whether there was a building standing in that spot. The evidence was very clear. I think we've all probably excavated very ambiguous remains, and this was not one of those cases. The foundation walls are really solid and intact. Not many utilities in and out in this area. So pretty clear that we have those. We have clear evidence of the burning, plenty of charred wood, good indication that the house itself was destroyed by fire, as the sort of mythical stories indicated. Also evidence of a chimney base here, the foundation, the footprint of a chimney that divided the house into a larger wing, a larger room on the north and a smaller room on the south, making us then able to identify that the north face was the main front of the building, an important feature to know. I promised you a little bit about the ambiguity of the written evidence and the sketches from the insurance documents. These three from 1800, 1809, and 1816 are all the insurance documents taken out by Monroe on the property. And the series of sketches are allegedly of the same building, but they're mutually inconsistent or internally inconsistent among the members of this list. And so that's why, in particular, they weren't entirely sure which side of the building that larger wing should have been on, if looking for a wing attached to that small standing house. There's enough similarity to say that, sure, they're talking about the same building, but the details aren't quite right. And we can accept that the insurance person didn't really care what the house looked like as much as what the materials were and the general size. And so it's further complicated by the fact that the only one that has the north and the south actually labeled on this sketch is the one from 1809. And oddly enough, it also seems to actually be backwards. I mean, so it doesn't fit the way we actually found it in the ground. So there's a lot of complications in this documentary record that I think we have to point to the purpose of these documents and what details they valued enough to get them absolutely right. So we're able to mark the foundations, the location of the foundations. These pavers on the ground surface mark the buried foundation walls. So we need to make that very clear to our visitors usually that these are not the foundation walls. These mark the surface of the area where the foundation walls are found. And we can interpret that the building burned probably late in the year of 1829. Many folks have looked for the contemporary documentary record of the house burning. Allison Bell, most notably, in 1999, did a good study and tried to find those documents. There's not much, and the tax record doesn't indicate a change until about 5 years after a pair of letters from that owner at the time, Goodwin. Remember, Monroe had sold this part in 1826, and the owner, Goodwin, wrote to his neighbor Higginbotham at what's now Morven, talking about his kindly attentions during his catastrophic loss by fire. And so those letters are very early in the year, January and February of 1830. So I think we're getting close there in getting to a date of the destruction. So then what of the standing house, right? We don't quite have, at this point in our research, if you go back to 2015, 2016, we need to nail down the actual, what is this house if we're taking away its former identity as a remnant wing of the Monroe main house. And thanks to some thorough sort of stem to stern by our colleagues, Carl Lounsbury, Jeff Clay, and Willie Graham, we were able to really point to a handful of very good indicators that this building would not be an appropriate example from 1799 when the main house was built. And they suggest rather first quarter of the 19th century. And of course, then we will get to in just a second, riding in on its white horse, dendrochronology to solve that question. But first, for a second, looking at the origins of this wrong story, we see the discussion of Mr. Massey, the Reverend Johnny Massey, I spoke about, who built that house, that's the yellow house on site. From this newspaper clipping, we see the statement that the main building is new, that's the yellow Massey house, and the old Monroe house having been nearly destroyed by fire. There remains yet in use a wing of the president's home. So, this wrong story existed for a long time before, before William and Mary's inheritance and before the current era. And so coming back to dendrochronology, which is the point that finally corrects the narrative here, and we were fortunate to find plenty of bark edge throughout the building to date all of its main phases. And I'll walk you through that very briefly. And it was the second round, to be absolutely sure, where we found bark edge in the corner post of the standing guest house that we were able to date. And what we get matches up beautifully with a letter, which was known from the archives, but not really addressed in terms of the site's interpretation. And in it, Monroe writes, "I have a new house with 2 rooms framed just below the present one for lodgers." And so if you were to back up and zoom out just for a second, you've got his discussion of a building that Kyle will talk about next, with it, the 3 rooms in which the servants lodged just below the well, the new house, and the present one. That makes a total of 3 houses, of which we could only point to 2 on the site at that point. The third, of course, being the one, the present one, the one that we had just discovered archaeologically, and the new house then being the 1818 guest house. I know that was a lot, and Monroe's handwriting does not make it any better. But this was there in the record. It just took looking at it carefully and critically to understand what it really meant. And so the little house being the new one, the house for lodgers, built by enslaved men, Peter Mallory and George Williams, that we can extrapolate out from the little bit that was written, were the people who built that house. And we can point through dendrochronology to the harvest dates of the timbers for the building. And so that main part, that 2-room lobby entrance building, we get a harvest date as late as the winter of 1817, 1818. Which fits that September 6th, 1818 letter that we just looked at together. And then that north part with that very rustic porch that I showed you from the 1930s photograph complicates it because it's clearly built against that 1818 building, but it's with reused timbers. And we could see even before that they were reused. And then the porch comes later. Kyle and I have been talking a little bit about the flipping from the north front being the main entrance. Before that addition, match the main front of the main house that we get archaeologically, and then switching to the service yard side later. And then a little connecting piece that later attached to the 1870s house. And so this is all pretty clear from the dendrochronology. All right. And so to go through then the public archaeology, once that's established, we turn really to a phase of public archaeology where it's engaged with really as much learning about the site as working with people and what they want to know and how they want to know it, and really kind of the larger interpretive goals of Highland we can get at through public archaeology. We start that by a little bit by understanding where our public is coming from in their perspectives about history, about the past, let's say really more precisely, and their attitudes towards learning about it. We had a big lift here from Professor Steve Hanna of the University of Mary Washington, who is a part of a research team at Tourism Reset, which conducts tourism industry studies in many places, really looking to identify, study, and challenge patterns of iniquity in order to make changes and make history more inclusive and more diverse. And so some really good analysis from Steve and talking to our visitors over the course of a weekend now 3 years ago. And there's a lot that he and his team were able to say about this. I'm going to just cherry pick just this one point here to say that in their pre-visit interests, the Highland visitors, and you can see here with our sister sites also included, our visitors are much more likely to report an interest pre-visit in American history and politics than in enslaved people and slavery, which is one of our main interpretive themes. And so, even though that comes in, we're seeing their top 3 pre-visit interests, it's still a major difference between the level of interest in history and politics, which should altogether be inclusive just inherently and diverse, and the discussion of slavery. And so then if we add in some other really good polling about potential museum visitors, again, through a whole suite of historic sites in Virginia by Susie Wilkening of Wilkening Consulting and compiled in May of 2020, we are able to look at, again, really cherry picking a very long and detailed report to talk about a specific set of cases, that there are generally 2 types of museum visitors among our going to our historic sites. One is sort of traditional in outlook. The other one is a label that Susie Wilkening created to describe this group called neoteric, which would be more open to new ideas and challenging current and accepted wisdom. And so if we consider this division here, my comment is, of course, it's no surprise. One of my personal great concerns and Highland's interests is in this great divide in our country, in our civic dialogue, in national politics, in our ability to talk about differences with people outside of our belief groups. And I mean, not religious belief groups, but in our beliefs about the world at large. And so to map Susie's Wilkening's traditional groups and her neoteric groups, so group 1 is less likely to prefer multiple perspectives, challenging topics, inclusive history, and shows a strong preference for, we want the facts, we want to make up our own minds. And then group 2 is more open to being challenged, to thinking sort of inherently about inclusivity, about the hard stories. I would certainly put slavery in that category. But as a note, they are much less likely to say, we just want the facts and want to make up our own minds, even though they still have a strong preference for that. They still want that. So just to know, everybody in these groups has a preference for making up their own minds, kind of thing. I realize I'm going long here. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So let's go through, what are our goals at Highland? Truthful, inclusive history, inspire curiosity and empathy about our shared past, really thinking about the present and future, and again, addressing these divides, finding common ground for civic dialogue. And I think discussion of the past has a real input in how we do that. And how do we do that at Highland? How do we do that through archaeology? Well, I think we have seen many of our DAACS colleagues and DAACS affiliated colleagues approaching inclusivity and diversity in really strong and data-driven ways. And I'm also looking here at the people-driven dialogue and how we work towards the conversations that change minds. It's that individual conversation. It's that sharing of ideas, sharing of new research questions that really help people to think in new ways about the past or about new learning. And so our field work from 2021 investigated several areas. I'm going to go through super quick. Looking at the main area of destruction in the center of the house, which is adjacent to that chimney, showing catastrophic burning of the site, piles of burned wood, and a lot of wall plaster, including these artifacts included two lock plates, one in iron on the left and one in a copper alloy on the right. They're currently under conservation, and I'm eager to share them all with you as soon as I can. But I can show you what they look like in terms of their x-rays. Again, the left is the iron one. And it shows two doors must have been that fell in rapid succession right on top of each other in the collapse of the house catastrophically by fire. And here's some of the plaster with really great analytical potential, even though it's a daunting quantity of it. Looking at some of the additional walls, hoping to get down into the cellar spaces, looking outside to see if we've missed any window, door, entry points. It seems we have not. And looking, this is a really important point, at the kitchen area, because we are, it's interesting that there seems to have been a kitchen attached in this building. And really the question that we're talking about in this kitchen that we would say to our visitors is, we're digging in this area to be near the kitchen because we want to talk to you about an enslaved cook named Hannah, who moved here in 1799 with the younger of her children, ages between 1 and 7. And they probably slept in this room as well as it being her workspace. And here we're outside the kitchen as close as we can get actually to it, because it would be under an impacted area, but just so that we could have these conversations with the public. And so this season, we did get some answers to those questions, including the buried A and some destruction level in the kitchen. But really where we got was these conversations. We got these conversations with the public, the idea that you ask a different question, you get a different story. And this is what we really wanted to plant, what we wanted to use to change minds, to get people thinking about the changes, the way we can think about the past in new ways with different stories. And so this is a main house where we can tell inclusive history. And so just to wrap up, in our goal of truthful and inclusive history, we're adding to our understanding of this house site. We're including non-elites. We are engaging people and asking new questions and pointing out diverse stories. And archaeology seems to be a non-fraught way to talk about the past. The past is politically charged right now. History is in Virginia. And this is a way to bring people together to talk about it without having them shut down or need to choose a camp. So, sorry, I think I went a little long. Thank you for listening. And thank you to many folks who made this possible.
Oh, thank you, Sara. I will mention this a little bit later too, but I do want to chime in and just say quickly, Sara alluded to it, but we currently have all the artifacts. DAACS currently has all the artifacts from Sara's excavation in 2021 in our lab. We are doing context analysis and digitization right now, and we'll be moving on to cataloging the artifacts. And we hope by, early spring, all of the data from Sara's excavations in 2021 from Highland will be online and available for the public and scholars to take a look at. So I would now like to introduce Kyle Edwards, who's also working at Highland. Kyle is an easement program archaeologist for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. He is also completing his dissertation at the University of Virginia in the Department of Anthropology on his work at Highland. And his talk today is titled "The Three Rooms in Which the Servants Lodged Below the Well, Revisiting the Triplex at James Monroe's Highland." Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Jillian, and thanks to DAACS, the ICJS, and Monticello Archaeology for hosting us today. As I was preparing for this talk, I sort of remembered that it's coming up on 10 years since I started working with Sara on Highland. And it's been really a great opportunity to work with her team, and sort of our community of archaeologists in and around Charlottesville. And I just want to start by saying it's been a great experience, and I think the plantation, the archaeology there is just beginning to show us what it has to offer. So hopefully today, Sara did a great job of talking about some of the big questions and how that translates into talking with people about archaeology. I'm going to be talking about questions today, but sort of a little bit smaller, more fine-grained questions that are about how we deal with this data and how we question the narrative we've been given to gain new insights into this place. So as Sara so eloquently covered in her presentation, the primary question for Highland when she began her tenure as executive director was to determine what and where of the main Monroe plantation house. This would provide a necessary physical anchor for Highland's public interpretation, as well as create a starting point for future research initiatives. There we go. Up until the discovery of the Monroe House, confusion about the landscape history at Highland muddled attempts at any clear narrative, but also allowed the landscape to be subsumed by popular narratives about Monroe. And I think Sara alluded to this a little bit, chief among these being that the house was seemingly small and common when compared to Montpelier or Monticello, mirroring Monroe's perceived political stature and wealth. I recall one of the first times I visited the property and you used to enter the 1818 guest house through the shed addition on the north facade. And I know this was in jest, but I remember being told that the low clearance in the doorway was so Monroe had to bow to Monticello upon his leaving the house to sort of pay homage to the great and powerful Jefferson. In a similar vein, much of the built environment that was demonstrably from the 19th century around the existing structures was attributed to Monroe to corroborate the documentary record. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this later. When Ravenna Archaeological Services first identified the 1799 foundation in 2014, it recontextualized the surrounding landscapes, drawing into question how the existing features related to the main house spatially and temporally. My research at Highland originally focused on documenting and understanding the early 19th century plantation landscape. So this rich sort of allusion and documents of bills of sales of the property and sort of tangential descriptions, sort of trying to define the place that he set up and envisioned as part of his social and political life. However, as we got deeper into the data, and sort of the nature of the place itself, we realized that a lot of the story was not actually only Monroe's place, but how that plantation changed over time into the landscape we saw today, and sort of how we got to the misremembering or misunderstanding of the place, which I think tells us more broadly some interesting cultural things about the social role of plantations, how they're important, and how we remember sort of our former presidents, especially in Virginia. So in this paper, I'd like to discuss how expanding the initial archaeological survey used to identify the house was used to help interrogate the broader plantation landscape with a focus on the area to the south of the 1818 guest house known as the service yard. This will be followed by a discussion of the archaeological data collected between 1979 and 1981 by University of Virginia Field School that cause into question long-held assumptions about sort of the service yard, its association with the Monroe landscape, and how it was utilized after Monroe left the property around 1826 by its subsequent 7 owners. So today, the Highland landscape centers around a core of extant historic and reconstructed buildings. These include the 1870s farmhouse built by the Massey family, with its attached rear ring that was once a standalone structure built in 1818, and 4 principal outbuildings, including a smokehouse, which you can see here sort of in the foreground, a reconstructed 3-bay triplex with 2 chimneys that has often been called the slave quarter or attributed as a Monroe period quarter, a 1-room structure referred to variously as the overseer's cottage and plantation office, and the ice house, which is here in the far background. Together, as I said before, these structures encompass the service yard, and you can see it forms this sort of C-shaped area right around the rear of the Massey house. The name itself kind of refers to the perception that this was sort of the main plantation work area during Monroe's ownership. And we can actually see how identifying the house in someplace else would sort of shake this assumption and cause us to reconsider what's going on here. So much like the house, and Sara went through some of the insurance plats and how that led to a misunderstanding of what the 1818 building was and the fate of the original plantation house. The interpretation of the outbuildings was subject to many similar misconceptions based on vague similarities and sort of tangential descriptions. The known structures, excuse me, I lost my place. For example, tax records and advertisements state that Monroe constructed an ice house on the property, and as a result, an ice house depicted in late 19th century and early 20th century photographs became Monroe's ice house. Similarly, we talked earlier about the 1818 letter from James Monroe to his son-in-law, George Hay, to discuss the renovation of the, quote, 3 rooms below the well in which the servants lodged. As a result, the 3-bayed structure, which I call the triplex, photographed here in 1908, has been interpreted as a Monroe's period quarter. Interestingly, an 1871 insurance plat, which you can see here in the top left corner, and I'll give a larger one. Quick shout out to Ben Ford for actually finding this document at the Library of Virginia. The 1871 insurance plat identifies the same structure as a kitchen, suggesting either a different origin or repurposing of the structure by later owners. Finally, the overseer's cottage, which again is sort of at the far south of the service yard, it's a little 1-room building. It actually doesn't appear in any physical documentation until 1929. So here in these plats drawn up for the sale of the property by the Massey family, you can see a small building in the top left identified as a cottage. So while this has been identified as a Monroe period structure and has all the appearances of a superstructure being related to that, we don't have a good documentary record that shows why it's here. We've done some archaeology related to it, and one of the suspicions we have is that maybe this is a building from the property that was perhaps moved or relocated at a certain time. Because just going back a slide, you can see it doesn't appear here within the service yard, unlike the smokehouse and the kitchen. And while not uncommon for buildings not to appear, this is sort of unusual that a building that's actually for dwelling wouldn't show up. So moving on. Sorry, I lost my page here. So, this raised a lot of questions for us after the discovery of the house, that whether we could verify any of these previous assumptions, much in the way Sara was looking to verify assumptions about the house. So prior to the current research, some archaeological data had been collected from within the service yard, but the area had not really been subject to any critical analysis. So as Sarah mentioned, Southside Historical Services, Inc., who conducted the first excavations of the guest house. They also excavated some units out in the service yard and identified some potentially architectural features, but their examination of the area didn't really go beyond that. Then from 1979 to 1981, the University of Virginia conducted an archaeological field school over the location of of the recently removed or the removed in the 20th century quarter, and identified as a kitchen in the 1871 plat, as well as the ice house. But these excavations preceded reconstructions of both of these buildings, so we don't have really a good record of where they occurred. And then later in 1992, William and Mary Center for Archaeological Research conducted excavations across most of the plantation core, but they only excavated 8 shovel tests within the service yard, 4 of which were positive. So this didn't really give us much clues beyond the fact that, yes, there were structures here, yes, there were archaeological remains, but we really couldn't temporally or functionally situate them within a broader plantation landscape. So when plantation survey began in 2013, Ravenna Archaeological Services excavated 249 shovel tests as part of their search for a house. And then beyond that, as part of my dissertation, I excavated, or rather led the excavation of, an additional 377 shovel tests in 7 yard spaces around the main house. This resulted in a total of 626 shovel tests at a regular 20-foot interval, sort of in the vicinity of the main house. And just for those of you who might not be archaeologists tuning in, shovel tests are small excavations at set intervals. They're about 1 foot in diameter. And essentially their purpose is to identify, are there artifacts here or are there not? In this map, you can see here, the green indicates ones where we recovered historic archaeological material, and the reds are negative. So there was no material there. And you can see there's sort of a clustering of material to the south and west of the main domestic structures. So in relation to this overall survey, there were 46 shovel tests excavated in and around the service yard. So this is a great expansion on the 8 that was dug by William and Mary Center for Archaeological Resources. These were excavated both within the yard and to the rear of the yard, with the supposition that if these buildings were in use, a lot of the refuse deposition would be away from the principal domestic structures and behind the buildings, which is sort of typical of these locations. From the survey excavations, an interesting pattern began to appear, which indicated temporal shifts in the use of space through time. Perhaps the most interesting discovery was the paucity of 18th and early 19th century materials from the service yard area, once thought to be the central activity area for the Monroe period landscape. Survey results showed the central yard space was mostly clear. So this is a kernel density map. The areas of red are high densities of artifacts and the areas of green are low. And there's really not a whole lot in the central yard that you'd expect to see in a working space. So of the 1,645 artifacts recovered from the service yard, 1,475 of these artifacts were located in the areas outside of the central yard space, so either to the north or the west of the buildings. Furthermore, nearly all of the tablewares recovered were undecorated refined earthenware, so ironstone and whiteware, that we typically associate with the latter portions of the 19th century. The absence of sort of ware types or ceramic types that date more to Monroe's ownership suggests this area is more heavily used during later occupied yard cleaning or grading could also explain this. Overall, this left us with an unclear analytical problem as modern disturbance and reconstruction through previous archaeology and museum development of these areas sort of affected other avenues we could use to explore when they were used. To compensate for this analytical problem we had, I chose to revisit artifacts collected by the University of Virginia between 1979 and 1881 that focus on the known, namely the ice house and the triplex. Most significantly, the triplex collection included some of them. So there's probably as many ceramics from this one excavation as all of our other excavations combined at this point. The one caveat is while the collection is well maintained, with artifacts being washed and labeled, the records for the project have since gone missing, making the only existing report an undergraduate thesis, which provides light descriptions of the methods of collection. Qualitatively, I would say the ceramics of the triplex look like they're from the late 19th century, as you can see here with all the undecorated wares. But we wanted to take a deeper analysis of this to see if we could find some real data that showed this was more of a focus of activity later on, or that there was a change in the use of the space through time. So using descriptions of the excavations in tandem with historic photographs of the structure, an approximate grid layout could be inferred. Most significantly, the one thesis said that stone deposits in units AA52, AA53, Z52, Z53, AA59, and AA61 were noted to be the approximate locations of the chimney bases. So this is my original map working with these two boxes where I noted architectural features, and they sort of describe the relation of these units to other buildings. So I was able to reconstruct the map and create an approximate grid, as well as show where artifacts were actually recovered. So this would be north being up in the approximate grid, and we have a red dot here, which is actually going to be their approximate site data. So simply by reading the excavation descriptions, I was able to approximate this grid, but we're left with an overall problem that we don't know precisely where each of these squares is or how they were excavated. So we're fundamentally limited in the ways in which we can analyze the artifacts in sort of a responsible and meaningful way. So to sort of alleviate this, rather than look at each individual location and how the artifacts relate to those places, I decided to look at the artifact data as a whole from the entire triplex excavation, since we know they all came from approximately the footprint of this building. Many of these artifacts, and I'll skip ahead here. The way we chose to do this was through mean ceramic dating. So as many of you know, this essentially uses the production range for known mass-produced ceramics to come up with an average date range for a site or particular location on a site. Ceramics work well for these because they change relatively rapidly, and by the 18th and 19th century, you have really good dates for when factories begin and stop making them. The one drawback of an MCD is that they're subject to bias based on the production span of a given ceramic. And by the 19th century, we have ones that are made well into the modern period. So if you have lots of late 19th century materials, your site may begin to look like a 20th century site. Fraser and the team at Monticello have a way with dealing with this, and I'm going to go through this quickly as I know we're short on time. That's called a blue MCD. That's essentially a weighted averaging of these times that values artifacts with a shorter production period over those with a longer production period. So it makes these ones that could skew your data count less. Sorry, Fraser, I don't mean to make you cringe by giving the one sentence description of your code. So taking about 500 ceramics recovered from the triplex site that are now recorded in DAACS, I was able to compute an MCD for the site itself. And what we received was an MCD of 1889. Then with the weighted average of the blue MCD, we have a date of 1871, which sort of indicates that the site that we see today, or maybe this building that's depicted in the 1908 tax documents, or the 1871 tax documents and 1908 photographs, is something that actually relates to the later landscape, which could possibly be superimposed over other features related to Monroe's ownership of the house. And sort of as a quick check to this, I compared these numbers to units excavated within and around the Monroe house related to the house excavation. And that revealed an MCD of 1839, which actually makes sense for the circa 1830 destruction date. And then ceramics from plantation survey of a whole, which is sort of more normalized between the two at 1844. So this while not conclusive, is beginning to paint a picture where the service yard looks more and more related to this period after Monroe's ownership, where we're going to have to do more detailed and fine-grained analysis to see how this might obscure our view of earlier sites. So ultimately, in going through the survey data and now revisiting some of the older excavations, I'm hoping to disentangle a little bit more how we get from the plantation established by Monroe on a former quarter farm to our understanding in the early to mid 20th century when this place becomes a museum. I think this postcard from the early 20th century exemplifies this pretty well. This shows the Massey House, and the text on it says the Monroe home near Charlottesville, sort of clearly indicating that this Victorian farmhouse belonged to James Monroe, who had died 30 years before it was even built. And actually what's interesting is how people within the community, both probably living on the plantation and visiting Charlottesville and visiting other places like Monticello, have struggled to create a narrative around this presidential home, and how we can use archaeology to begin to think critically about how we construct these narratives, both in the way that we can sort of construct idealized past and past that sort of support what we already believe to be true, that, you know, James Monroe was a president and he wasn't quite as important as Monroe or as Jefferson and Madison. So we have the smaller house. Anyway, I think we're fully out of time now. I'm sorry I rushed through the end of that, but and I hope in the coming months, years, that teach Highland and answer new questions about plantations in the Piedmont.
Great, thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Julie.
This has been terrific. I think your connection was a little slow at the end, broke up a little bit, but we got it all, which is terrific. And I'll also note that we're working with Kyle to get the data from his shovel test pit surveys into DAACS as well. So that we hope in the next year or two, both the work that Sarah's done and the work that Kyle's done will be in the archive. We'll wrap up for this session. So thanks